Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us, and to Governors for Schools for having me. My name is Kaley, and I'm the lead content editor at the Key for School Governors. We provide support to governing boards all up and down the country on all issues of board management and school leadership. So today what we're going to be talking about is coronavirus and the impact that it's going to have on your school. We're also going to be talking about the kind of key challenges that coronavirus and lockdown will pose and what these mean for your school improvement planning and monitoring efforts as a board. We'll also talk a little bit about what school reopening may look like based on what the government has announced so far and how boards can help their schools to prepare. And then this will help you understand how to prioritize your board's work while your school is closed or while it's in the process of reopening. Thank you very much. All right, so first we're going to talk about the challenges that coronavirus and lockdown have posed to schools. The first thing to talk about is pastoral challenges, and these are the most significant challenges that your school will probably face. And when I talk about pastoral challenges, I'm talking about things like missing key transition points, either between key stages within a school, so for instance, moving from reception to year 1, or between school stages, so moving from year 6 up into secondary school. Vulnerable pupils will have spent more time in unstable home situations, which is obviously concerning from a safeguarding perspective. We're talking about things like resettling into school routines and reestablishing expectations. The challenges of supporting pupils and staff through bereavement, the mental health challenges that pupils might be experiencing, and the challenges of reestablishing relationships to help the school get back up and running again. Why are these the focus? The most important thing to acknowledge is that this has been a really stressful time for everyone, adults and pupils alike. It's absolutely normal for pupils to feel isolated or anxious or stressed or unsure about things like going back to life as normal, whatever as normal means, or to be unsure about what their pre-lockdown relationships will be like. And the list really does go on. And in order to get pupils into a place where they're ready to learn, schools need to address these feelings that pupils will have and to address some of these challenges. And I could really spend an hour talking about these challenges in detail, but really the thing that binds all of these together, the common thread here, is that pupils will feel a little bit at sea and staff will feel a little bit at sea. And it will be really difficult for schools to manage pupils who have had such an upheaval in their normal lives and getting them settled back into the regular school routine and school structure. As well as making sure that they're keeping on top of the likely sort of uptick a bit in the kind of safeguarding or welfare concerns that they're likely to have as a result of things like missed transition points or more time in unstable homes or indeed bereavement. So from a governing board perspective, the thing to bear in mind, obviously, is that your staff, your head teachers, your designated safeguarding leads, and your special educational needs coordinators in particular are really well equipped to deal with these challenges. This is right in their wheelhouse. They have all the training they need to do this well. The challenge will be that they are dealing with these issues in much more volume than they would normally do. So the workload associated is going to be significantly more, but your school will probably be focusing primarily on the pastoral support side of things in the early weeks and potentially months after school reopens, because we know that with a phased reopening, it's likely that you'll have new cohorts settling into school at regular or semi-regular intervals. And as a result, it will be hard to even deliver an academic curriculum in that sense anyway. So the focus will very much be pastoral and getting pupils back to some level of normality. And so you should expect to see that focus shift a little bit in the reports you're seeing to your board. That brings us on to the academic challenges. Even when a school is running normally, gaps emerge in terms of where pupils are in their learning, and closure and lockdown will have made these gaps more pronounced. Your board is already probably quite practiced at looking at the gaps that may emerge between disadvantaged pupils, those pupils eligible for the pupil premium, and their peers in terms of both progress and attainment. And this will essentially be a magnified version of that challenge. Schools will need to contend with things like gaps in learning due to the time spent out of school, but also a disparity in the amount of work or support pupils do, the amount of work pupils are able to accomplish at home because of the differences in support that may be available to them. Schools will also be thinking quite a lot about adapting their curriculum plans to account for where pupils are after closure and remote learning. Most of your schools, in light of the new Ofsted framework, will have been looking at the curriculum in some way, either sort of sharpening curriculum plans or redeveloping aspects of the curriculum, and that work will probably continue, but it's worth acknowledging that because of the quite significant challenges in terms of lost learning time that coronavirus and lockdown have presented to your schools, there will be a lot of focus on adapting curriculum planning to make sure that schools are meeting pupils where they are and helping them to sort of close those gaps. In addition to the pastoral and academic challenges, there's also schools are facing a lot of financial challenges as well. Lots of schools will be dealing with things like having paid lump sums out of the school budget to cover providing free school meals prior to the voucher scheme being introduced. And lots of schools are reporting to us that they're seeing loss of income from clubs or lettings, and that loss of income is really making it challenging for them to balance the books. Schools can reclaim some of these costs eventually, but this will be quite far down the line, and it may still cause budget pressures or cash flow issues. Even if your school's budget remains balanced, you may find that you need to realign your budget with new school improvement priorities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few moments. But it's worth being aware that financial challenges are a big part of this for schools. And so it's worth keeping an eye on this as a board. Finally, last but certainly not least, is school reopening. The recent announcements about school reopening have created a lot of uncertainty. School leaders are going to be struggling with understanding how reopening might look and how to balance competing demands. So, for example, adhering to government guidance without falling foul of health and safety or employment law. Much of the planning for school reopening will be too operational for governors to get involved in directly, but the more support you can provide for your school leaders, the better. This is an unprecedented situation that we're all in, and your head teacher probably does need as many brains in a room as they can possibly get to help them solve these tricky challenges, particularly the logistical ones that head teachers are not used to dealing with on quite this scale and on quite such a short time frame. To give you a picture of the kinds of challenges that reopening will present, it will be things like identifying how many staff your school will have available and which members of staff should come in. This isn't just a matter of which staff are kind of clinically vulnerable and thus need to stay at home. There's all kinds of challenges. If staff have children of their own who are not of school age, or who are in an age group that won't be returning to school immediately, they might have childcare challenges. We also know that lots of teachers may travel quite some distance to get to work, and they rely on public transport to do so, and so maybe feeling anxious about the idea of having to travel on public transport to get to and from work. So all of these things are going to affect which staff members can or should be coming into school. Another big issue is going to be organizing pupil groups and the school day in a way that minimizes risk as much as possible. The government has provided some guidance for schools on the way to do this, but they are still expecting schools to apply that sensibly in their own context. And that will be quite a challenge for schools over the coming weeks. There will be big questions and challenges around scaling up operations like catering, dealing with parent concerns about school reopening. We know that this is going to be a somewhat anxious issue for parents up and down the country, and unfortunately it will be head teachers who are on the receiving end of that anxiety rather than the government, which is potentially as it should be. And so the more support that you can provide actually for your head teacher in terms of reassuring parents and being there to support effective communication is a really good thing. And then in addition to just identifying how many staff your school will need or have available and which of those staff it will be, there will be a lot of staffing challenges, as you'll have seen in the news in recent days, around things like workload, mental health, and safety. We know that the unions are in conversations with the DFE at the moment about how school opening is going to affect staff. There's some questions about the health and safety advice that the government has provided. And just on an individual level, we know that staff will be feeling lots of things potentially about this. And while they may want to get back into school, want to get back to some level of normality, or to provide some level of increased support for pupils who are vulnerable or disadvantaged, they may be conflicted with their own concerns about health and safety. And these are really challenging conversations for your head teacher to have. And they will have to be conversations, really open lines of communication. And so being aware of that and helping where you can will be really useful for your head teacher. So we've just talked a little bit about what the big challenges are and how coronavirus will have impacted your school. But what does this mean for school improvement planning from a governing board perspective? The most important thing to say is that most of how your school approaches school improvement planning won't change much, especially in the long term. Broad areas of focus or assessments of strengths and weaknesses or self-evaluation will likely remain mostly the same. However, you should expect specific actions or strategies to change. For example, if your school has been refining or redeveloping its curriculum, this will likely continue, but curriculum planning may change to account for lost learning time. Or if your school has been focusing on how to better support pupil mental health, that work will probably continue, but emphasis, timescales, or strategies may need adapting in light of coronavirus. Specific actions or specific strategies will probably change. So I mentioned that in the long term, school improvement planning won't change that much, but I would encourage you to think about the more pronounced difference you'll likely see between the long-term school improvement planning and short and medium-term challenges. I'd encourage you to think about this in the paradigm of school recovery versus school improvement. In the short term, schools will be focused on recovery, getting back to where they were before closure, and in the medium term, more focus on helping pupils to get back on track academically. Long term, your school's improvement priorities won't likely have shifted too much, but in the short term, there is going to probably be quite a shift in focus. And practically speaking, this means that the evidence that you'll have on key monitoring metrics like teaching, like the quality of teaching and learning, or behavior patterns, will be less robust than usual. And I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail in just a few moments, but I think it's really important for boards to think about the difference between school recovery and school improvement, and helping your school get back on track first before pressing ahead with those more long-term strategic improvement priorities. The one exception that I would potentially suggest to that split between school recovery and school improvement is this idea of learning from closure and your school's remote learning or remote teaching efforts. Schools have a really big opportunity to apply what they've learned from the experience of remote learning and school closure to wider school improvement. And that might not necessarily happen in the immediate or even in the medium term, but it's certainly something that schools will be thinking about and should be thinking about. For example, the use of technology to support learning has obviously been forced upon us all a little bit. Some schools were doing this already, but the vast majority weren't. And so it's worth thinking about both from a school leadership perspective and from a governing board perspective, how your school can incorporate some of what it's learned about using technology to support learning into its wider approach to teaching and learning. Another really good example of this is that schools are learning a lot at the moment about what really effective home learning looks like, and what good independent learning looks like, and what skills pupils really need to have to be good independent learners. And this provides a really wonderful opportunity for schools to reevaluate and rethink its approaches to things like homework. And this is something that schools can learn from now and have a really wide impact on broader school provision. And the governing board is in a really unique position to be able to encourage that kind of thinking and encourage schools to be taking this not just as a challenge or a trial by fire, but actually a learning opportunity, and to be encouraging school leaders to think about these and other issues that have kind of come to the fore as a result of this. So what do governors need to do? What does all of this mean for what your board should be doing now? I would suggest that there are 4 key things that you'll need to prioritize and focus on in terms of supporting your school. And I'll run through these 4 things now, and then I'll touch on each of them in a little bit more detail. The first is thinking about how your board's structure and link governance arrangements align with your school's short and medium-term challenges. The next is to consider the emphasis your school places on mental health and well-being for pupils. Next is assessing your data in context, and being prepared to revisit your budgets. So I'll come on to each of these in a little bit more detail now. When I say considering your board structure and link governance arrangements, the first thing to say is that there's no right or wrong way to do this. Your committee structures, your link governor roles, and your reporting arrangements should, if they're doing their jobs, reflect your school's priorities, facilitate the right level of challenge and support for school staff, and help each governor get the right level of detail while ensuring that the board runs efficiently. Boards have loads of business that they need to get through in any given meeting, and so your committee structures, link roles, and reporting arrangements should facilitate you getting through as much business as possible and achieving the right level of detail. The way that you do this on your board and the arrangements that support this will likely vary between your school and the school around the corner. So just as an example, if we take our mental health and well-being example from earlier, and you realize that these pastoral challenges that your school is going to be facing are really quite significant, there's going to need to be a lot of focus on these from the school leadership perspective, which means that there should be focus from a board perspective as well. Your board may already have a committee that gets a semi-regular report about pupil mental health and well-being. But in the context, you may think that actually, you don't know if a committee is the right place for that reporting to go. You actually might decide that a half-termly report to the full governing board is going to make sure that all of the governors on your board get the information they need about this. And you'll make these decisions based on all kinds of things. So for instance, if you have a governor on your board who has experience of mental health or well-being, or perhaps special educational needs, then that person may be in a strong enough position, have enough expertise to be a really effective link governor. And you may think that that person as a point person for your board is the right way to go. If you don't have that level of expertise, or even if you do, but you decide that actually the amount of attention you want to give this is different, you may decide that a dedicated committee is potentially the right way to go. Reporting to the full governing board is going to be more useful for you. There's all kinds of ways that you can do it, and it's worth working really closely with your school leaders to figure out the best arrangement for you that will both give your board the information it needs to support and challenge effectively, but also not overburden your school leaders with additional reporting requirements that are kind of adding on to the workload that will already be quite significant when schools eventually do reopen, whenever that is. So it's worth thinking about whether you can reorganize your board reporting or monitoring or committee structures to make sure that they're really aligned with both your short and medium term challenges. And then you can always change these up again later if you need to. I've talked a lot about mental health and well-being, and that's because it's absolutely critical. The government is already encouraging schools to place more emphasis on this, and coronavirus will probably force schools to make faster progress. As a board, this probably means that you'll need to do a few things. The first is closer monitoring of mental health, well-being, and safeguarding in the short and medium term. The next is providing support for key members of staff, like your designated safeguarding lead or your special educational needs coordinator. It'll be thinking about the kind of training and support that your staff have on mental health, and what your school could be doing that's more or different potentially. And then looking at policies and procedures and action plans through a well-being lens. None of this means that as a board, you need to understand mental health needs in a lot of detail. It just means that you are asking the same kinds of challenging questions about mental health and well-being that you would about teaching and learning or workload. The way that boards responded to the DFE's workload challenge, when the DFE really encouraged schools to take ownership of workload and try and take the initiative to reduce it. The way that a lot of boards really tackled this well is by looking at every policy that crossed the board or a committee or a link governor, and asking a few critical questions about the impact that policy, that procedure, that change to an action plan is going to have on someone's workload. The same approach can be applied here. Governing boards work across every aspect of school leadership, and so you have a view across the piece in a way that's really unique and valuable. So I'd encourage you to use it to think about how you can help embed mental health and well-being as a focus across your school. This means that if you do this, it means that your school's approach is much less likely to be tokenistic. It's not just going to be we wrote a mental health and well-being policy and it's on our website sort of situation. It's going to be embedded into the way that the school thinks about everything it does. And your board is in a position to really drive that approach, which is great. On the monitoring and support point, there's obviously little that governors can practically do. You can't manage safeguarding referrals. You can't deliver mental health training. But it's just about being there for those critical members of staff and understanding what trends they're seeing, what support they think they need, what resources they think they need. And also just as a result of the fact that there's going to be a lot of stress and a lot of workload around this issue, just being there to make sure that those key members of staff are well in themselves, being that support for them, and just so that they know that they have a source of support, someone that they can talk to if they're feeling unsure, or just need an ear to listen. That's a really important role that boards can play in all of this. I want to talk a little bit now about looking at your data in context, because a lot of what we've talked about in terms of the challenges that your school is facing will show up in your data at some point, and it's really important that governors address this in a way that's really constructive. Important data is always more useful with context, and part of your job as a governor is to assess and challenge whether the data that you're seeing matches with the context that you're presented or with what you see when you go on your monitoring visits. Understanding the issues that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation will help you get a really in-depth knowledge of the context that your school is operating in and the challenges that coronavirus and school closure have presented. And this understanding, that detailed understanding, that nuance, will help you better understand the information that you're presented with. As an example, you'll probably start to see in your regular reporting from school leaders about behavior incidents, for example, you'll likely see an uptick in behavior incidents. And that's not because the kids are suddenly worse, and it's not because your staff have suddenly forgotten how to do their jobs or forgotten how to manage a classroom. That's not what it is at all. It's actually just that this is a really complicated, stressful situation for everyone. There are lots of balls in the air, lots of moving parts, and pupils and staff and families more broadly are likely to be feeling quite anxious and uncertain in this time, and that will probably manifest in the behavior that you see, especially for younger pupils who may be dealing with things like anxiety or bereavement but not have the language to express that. So they'll act out rather than talking to someone about it. And so you'll probably see that in behavior data, but you don't need to be alarmed about that, really. Your school leaders are probably well aware of what's going on, and even though they're going to record it so that they can keep an eye on it and make sure that in the short term they can tackle any trends or spikes or make adjustments, for instance, to a behavior policy, understanding the context that your school is working in will really help you know where to push and where not to, basically. Another really good example of this is that the impact of this will probably have quite a long tail in terms of your attainment and progress data. As I mentioned before, being in a place where pupils are ready to learn is a prerequisite for them kind of making any progress from an academic perspective. But also, even when they are doing that, they've missed out on a lot of school. There's a lot of gaps that need to be filled. Teachers are going to have to be adapting what they're used to teaching to pupils who would normally have come to them, further up the school, for example, would normally have come to them with certain knowledge or skills and won't necessarily have those in as developed a way. There's going to be all kinds of challenges that affect the data that you're seeing about the quality of teaching and learning or attainment or progress. And the more you can keep in your mind the sort of pastoral challenges and the impact that that's having, the more constructive your conversations with your school leaders are going to be. Your job is obviously to challenge your head teachers and your school leaders and to make sure they're doing the best job possible. But as you know, as governors, we shouldn't try and hold school leaders to account for something that they can't control. And there are a lot of things here that school leaders just can't control. And so making sure that you're aware of the context and bearing that in mind when you're looking at the data you're presented with will make the conversations more constructive, and will make sure that that relationship that you have between your board and your head teacher in particular doesn't strain. Finally, I think it's probably worth bearing in mind that budgets will either need revisiting, or if you're an academy, your budget will probably be quite different to what you're used to. If you're in a maintained school, your school leaders planned a budget with no inkling of the challenges that were to come, and your spending priorities for your school may have changed a fair bit. If you're in an academy and you're coming up to school improvement, or sorry, school budget setting period this term, the budget that you'll be setting will be developed in light of quite unique circumstances and challenges, and it's worth bearing that in mind and having really detailed conversations about that with your school leaders. To give you an example of the kind of impact that this may have, I've already touched on the sort of loss of income side of things, which may make any budgeting decision a more challenging one. But your school improvement priorities will have shifted, like in the short term anyway. And your budget should absolutely align with your school improvement priorities, the biggest challenges that your school is tackling. So a good example of this is that as your school settles in and gets a more detailed understanding of the pastoral challenges facing its pupils and staff, your school leaders may decide that the types of support that they need to provide are not things that they're well equipped to do at the moment, or to provide at the moment. And that may be a training issue, it may be a resourcing issue, it may be that your head teacher feels quite strongly that bringing in child psychologists, or this is going to sound flippant, but things like therapy animals, therapy dogs, or things like that, where to help pupils deal with the anxiety that they may be struggling with. Your head teacher may find that those types of interventions are really going to have an impact, and that money that they had planned to spend elsewhere might actually be better spent on things like that. Likewise, from an academic interventions perspective, you may find that with pupils having lost as much learning time as they did, or disadvantaged pupils in particular, or vulnerable pupils missing as much learning time as they did, that your school leaders may decide that the types of interventions that they want to run for maths or English might be quite different, and might need resources that they hadn't originally budgeted on. And that might even be, an additional TA, or training so that a TA can run a specific type of program. And that may mean moving money around a little bit. And so it's worth keeping a really close eye on that, having those conversations with your school leaders about what the impact they imagine will be on their budget, and where their spending might want to change, and going from there. So we've covered a lot of ground. Hopefully this has given you an overview of the types of challenges that your school is facing upon reopening, and what you as a board can do to support them. We've had a lot of questions coming into us here at the Key about some kind of key issues related to this, so I'll go through a couple of those with you now, and then hopefully tackle some additional ones that have come through. So the first question that we've been getting quite a lot of is whether schools can choose to open the school to year groups other than the ones specified in the DFE's guidance. And actually, wider questions. This is part of a kind of a wider set of questions around organizing schools provision and what schools can and can't do. So whether you can open to additional or different year groups, how to, who's in charge of deciding what the school's rota looks like, etc. we would recommend at this stage that you follow the DFE's guidance as closely as you possibly can. So the DFE has specified, just to review, that if you're a primary school, in addition to your children of critical workers and your vulnerable children, you should be opening to nursery, reception, year 1 and year 6. And for secondary schools, in addition to children of critical workers and vulnerable children, you should be opening to those in years 10 and 12. We've had a lot of questions about whether, for example, if you're an infant school, whether you can open to year 2, because those children would be at the point of transferring to a junior school. And at the moment, we would recommend that you follow the DFE's guidance and you stick to the year groups that they've suggested. There's a lot of negotiation going on. There's a lot of discussion in the sector about how best to support pupils to get back into school. But given that the unions have also kind of supported the DFE's recommendations here and recommended that schools also plan for opening for those year groups, that's also what we would recommend. As far as other aspects of organizing your provision, so for instance, how you might organize your rota, or how you might fit all of the pupils you're supposed to fit in, that's more for head teachers to decide. But in terms of the year groups opening to, we would recommend you stick to the DFE's guidance. A really common question that we've had coming through is whether governing boards can be held liable for illness or deaths from COVID-19. This is quite a complicated picture, and the reason that there's so much uncertainty about this, I think, is because while the DFE is recommending that schools open, they've made it quite clear that health and safety and employment law still applies. And so your board still does have a duty of care to your employees, and you need to make sure that when they return to work, they can be kept safe. In order to do this, under health and safety law, your school needs to conduct a risk assessment. And the advice that we've received so far is that if your school conducts a risk assessment based on the DFE's guidance and adheres to that guidance as closely as it possibly can, then you will be upholding your responsibilities under health and safety law, and you will be acting on that duty of care. Obviously, we know that schools and boards have a lot of questions about the DFE's guidance and the reliability of it. We know that there's lots of questions out there, but the advice that we have so far is that as long as you're following your health and safety procedures, conducting a risk assessment based on the DFE's guidance, which is the best guidance for schools that we currently have available, and making sure that as a board, you're reviewing that risk assessment, challenging it, making sure that you're getting additional advice where you feel like you need it, then you will be okay. But obviously we know that there are lots of questions about this, and if you are concerned, it's worth seeking additional health and safety advice or legal advice. We can't provide a kind of a blanket answer for that question, I'm afraid. That kind of ties into another one of the common questions, which is whether governors can refuse to allow the school to reopen. We don't know is the short answer to this. It seems like governors do have some level of discretion here, especially if you are concerned that you have seen a risk assessment that you don't feel conforms to the DFE's guidance, or you don't feel like your school is able to put all of the health and safety measures that the government has recommended in place. So for instance, if you don't have enough staff or you can't provide PPE, etc., then we do think that there's some there's some latitude for governing boards to say, well, actually, we're going to hold on reopening until we are sure that we can meet these requirements. But we have a question into the Department for Education on this at the moment, because we do know that there's lots of there's lots of conflicting advice on this, where some local authorities are saying that they're going to direct schools not to open, and so we know that this is a bit of a muddy picture, and we're trying to get an answer on that as soon as possible. Another common question that we're getting is why PPE isn't being recommended in schools. The government is recommending PPE, but they're recommending it in limited circumstances. So they're not recommending that people wear face coverings or masks or gloves all the time, only in specific situations. For instance, when they're dealing with a child who is ill, who's coughing, sneezing, or vomiting, and needs close care. The reason that they're not recommending face masks or face coverings outside of that seems to be a couple of things. The first being that they're trying to reserve as much PPE as possible for clinical settings, but there's also an issue apparently around PPE not being used properly, and that if you don't use PPE properly, it can actually undermine other health and safety measures, like measures around social distancing or washing your hands, or not touching your face. So for instance, if you have a face covering or a mask that doesn't fit properly, you're more likely to touch your face in those situations, and that actually can be counterproductive. Likewise, face coverings need to be used properly. They can't just be like any old t-shirt wrapped around your face. And if you do wear a face covering, they need to be washed daily. And because there's quite a high likelihood of improper use, it undermines other health and safety measures. And so that's why they're not recommending, as far as we understand, that's why they're not recommending wider, kind of more general PPE use, and they're only recommending it in certain situations. We've had a couple more questions that I'll try and answer, because we've got a few minutes left. The first is around whether schools are organizing any kind of health testing. We are aware that some schools are thinking about putting health testing regimes, either temperature checks or COVID tests or things like that, in place. You can put these measures in place, but the important thing to note is that while you can ask staff and pupils to submit to these tests, you cannot compel them to do so. This is a consent-based exercise, because the information that you're collecting about them, about their health, is sensitive personal data, and so has additional protections under the General Data Protection Regulation. So while we do know that schools are thinking about the testing that they can put in place, you cannot require people to submit to testing or indeed to disclose the results of any testing to you. So that makes those measures potentially slightly less effective. A really common question, when schools will have a confirmation date on whether or not schools will in fact reopen, and unfortunately we just don't know. The government won't confirm at what point schools will know whether they are indeed going ahead. I suspect that it's actually probably hard for the government to say, because there are so many tests. There's a number of measures that they're using to decide whether it's safe to go ahead. The important thing, though, is that while the 1st of June is the earliest from which the government has said that they will encourage schools to open, your school does not have to open on the 1st of June if it is not practical for you to do so. That's just the earliest point at which they are encouraging schools to continue, like to start broadening their provision, as it were. So it's we just don't know when schools will have an ironclad go ahead from the government at this stage. I think I've got time for one more question, and it's a really lovely one about what practical steps governing boards can take to support staff well-being. I think the first thing to say is that with anything to do with staff well-being, it's really important that you don't approach it in a tokenistic kind of way. In order for staff well-being and initiatives to be really effective, your staff needs to feed into them in a way that's meaningful. So I discourage kind of unilateral governing board decisions on buying in an occupational health service, or providing yoga on a Friday, or whatever it might be. And that might sound flippant, but those are those are really well-meaning initiatives that if you don't get staff input, what they really need, all the most well-meaning initiatives in the world aren't going to go too far. So I would really encourage you to have meaningful conversations about staff well-being, but rather than phrasing them in a, what can we do to make to make well-being better, to help, those are questions you should also have. It's important to start those conversations with understanding what people's challenges are, and that you'll probably have to have these conversations multiple times. So the challenges that people are having during lockdown and school closure, for instance, from a staff perspective, they're juggling childcare for their own children, or they have elderly or poorly relatives that they're helping to support, or they've got a partner who's also working from home and whose job is demanding. And there's all of these things we're all juggling at the moment. What they need now will probably be quite different from what they feel they need once school reopens. And so it's worth having these conversations a number of times, probably more regularly than you normally would, given that the situation is changing so quickly. And to start by having conversations about what they're experiencing, what their challenges are, what they're feeling, and then moving from there into conversations about what sorts of measures they think would be really helpful. At the moment, we're investigating whether it would be, for instance, possible for school, like particularly in maintained schools, whether it would be possible for schools to offer time off in lieu. We know that loads of staff have worked straight through from the kind of Easter break through half terms and all other kinds of things. So we know that people are probably quite burnt out. So we're investigating whether that's potentially going to be useful, whether there are other measures like continuing to work on a rota when the school reopens, or having kind of how you can organize breaks and time off to make it so that people actually do get to decompress a little bit. So it's just, I wish there were a really easy answer where I could say just do all these things, and unfortunately there just isn't one of those. The most important thing to do is just to have really just have a lot of really focused conversations with staff, and to kind of make it a collaborative process and make sure that they have a lot of input into the support that you will eventually provide. I think that's all I have time for, but if you have any additional questions, my contact details are there. We'd be really keen to hear from you, and to hear as well about any exciting things that your board is doing to tackle any of these challenges. We'd love to hear from you about that as well. And thank you very much.